Hello, Brian Pierce with the Pierce Brothers. Today we're going to do a video of a company that a lot of people have either forgotten existed or never knew existed. It's called Great Western Arms Company. And they were, this is not something on collectors. I'll put that down so Joe can get those in the video. This is not about collecting them. It's just kind of an overview of the company, but we're going to talk a lot of details about the guns and some of the calibers, some of the historical significance, how they came about, and it's kind of a really interesting story. They were only in business about 10 years. From 1954 is generally when they were considered to have been started into manufacture until about 1964. And a gentleman by the name of Bill Wilson is the one that really got the ball rolling on the company. And that's not to be confused with Bill Wilson of Wilson Combat. So, but Bill Wilson, he actually went back to Colt 2 different times, at least that I'm aware of. To be clear, these were made in Los Angeles, California. And he went from California, traveled clear back to Connecticut twice and met with Colt, and they assured him, no, we're done with the single action Colt, we're not going to make any more, and so forth and so on. Well, what happened? I got to go back a little bit further. What happened? Of course, the Colt single action was produced continuously from 1873 until 1940. At the beginning of the war, 1940 or 41, Colt knew they were going into war. They had produce military guns and so forth, and of course the Great Depression really took a toll on gun sales in general, so the number of guns that Colt was selling during the 30s was very minimal. Of course, the double action revolver was finding a lot of favor, and Colt after the war considered it dead, almost. But this gun right here is a Colt single action Army, and it's what's commonly known as the pre-war post-war guns. And this is a 5.5-inch 45. Colt assembled beginning in the late 1940s. They assembled 338 of these guns. So this is a very rare gun. And the reason they call it pre-war, post-war is that they used pre-war parts to assemble them and frames and so forth. And they put together these guns and they gave them to. They used them as sample guns. They sent them to very dignified people and so forth. What Colt was doing is they were sticking their toe in the water to see what the demand was for the single action Army. And they discovered that it was a very high demand. And this gun was made in 1948, 5.5-inch 45. I'll do a video on it sometime, along with some other pre-war, post-wars that I have. But these were very significant guns. So Colt kind of was keeping their foot in the water whether they should retool and make the single action Army again. But they assured Bill Wilson, the new president or owner of Great Western Arms, that no, they're not going to make it. And so Bill was trying to get his ducks in a row, as you say, to manufacture. Meanwhile, Bill Ruger came out with the little Ruger single 6, fabulous little gun. That happened in 1953, and they just sold like crazy. I mean, they were high demand. It obviously proved that there was a demand for the single action Army. And Bill Wilson, in 1954, began shipping what he called the Great Western Frontier model, or in some references it was referred to as the Frontier 6-shooter. And it was pretty much, let me just get a good example here. It was pretty much a patterned after the Colt single action Army. It had a few little changes. The grip frame was slightly smaller, but not much, or the backstrap and trigger guard combination came with imitation plastic stag grips, which looked terrible, but they were popular in the movies and they were inexpensive to get the gun out the door. This particular gun's a 44 special. But another thing he did that's very important to know is you'll see this cut out in the hammer, and you'll see what's commonly known as a Christie style firing pin. That was actually developed by Herb Bradley back in the late 1920s, I believe. And he lived in Salmon, Idaho, of all places. Was actually a friend of Elmer Keith's. And what it did, it was, in theory, it allowed the gun to handle higher pressures without primer flow. And that's a whole nother story. My experience doesn't always support that, but that's what they did. Now, interesting, and this is very important, they also offered, Great Western also offered, I could call up and order a gun and get it with a standard Colt hammer, which I should have shown this a little better, Joe, but the Colt hammer, as you can see, had the hammer mounted firing pin here, whereas the Great Western is of course cut out and a frame mounted firing pin. So that was one of the notable changes. But you could order the Colt hammer, and when it actually was physically made by Colt for the Great Western guns. So so Great Western early on, they had a lot of issues. They ultimately I also going to mention Elmer Keith made the comment in his book This Guns that the frame was a little different length, Colt, and so on. My measurements is I've not found that. It doesn't really exist in my opinion, but they struggled with things. They didn't have very good springs. They had quality control problems. One thing I did see that was a pretty common problem with them early on was that the barrel shank, the portion that protrudes back through the frame, was very small diameter from here to here. So you get a little leading in that forcing cone and you'd split the barrel. I've actually split a couple of them and replaced the barrels. That you look at a Colt or most other Great Westerns and they had a lot thicker barrel shank on there. So some of the guns had a kind of an imitation case coloring on them. It never had the beautiful appearance of a Colt, but they were trying. They constructed the guns incidentally out of 4130 on the frame and on the backstrap and trigger guard. The cylinders were made of 4140, and the hammers were 66,000 series chromoly steel. I don't remember the number right off the top of my head. But now what's interesting is in the 22 calibers, they used a softer steel on those. Now Great Western, they made some pretty wild claims about strength and pressures, and they published some stuff that I look at today and I'm like, oh, there is just no way. I don't believe it. I've never blown up a gun accidentally. I have destruction tested many guns intentionally where they were remotely controlled fired with known pressure loads to learn the destruction point. And Great Western made some outlandish claims, and I treat them like a Colt. I don't shoot loads in them that I would not shoot in a Colt, even though Great Western made some claims there. Now, another interesting chapter in this, I'm going to cover a couple of interesting points in this, is that Great Western, well, of course, most people know that in December 29th, 1955, the first Smith & Wesson 44 Magnum shipped to the president of Remington Arms Company. Following that, Julian Hatcher and Elmer Keith got their first guns in 1956, January 56. So this kind of caught the industry by surprise. Before that happened, Bill Ruger actually had an employee find some empty cases in an industry dumping ground. They were marked 44 Remington Magnum, UMC, meaning Remington, and so forth. And so Bill went to Remington Arms and met with some contacts there. He said, I need to know about what this cartridge is. And they put some ammo in a plastic bag and sent it out the door with him. So Bill knew what he had to what he had to do to make a gun to work around that cartridge. So now keep in mind, Bill offered the single 6 in 1953. He came out with the Black Hawk flat top 357 in 1955. Now, why this is significant with Great Western, these guns are commonly referred to as having a Colt-sized cylinder. They were actually about 20 thousandths larger in diameter, which gave it quite a bit more strength, that actually would hold the 44 Magnum and chamber it and fire it. But the difference is, Bill, at that time, he knew that hand loaders like Elmer Keith and the Keith bullet was so popular that you could not load the Keith bullet in that and crimp it in the crimp groove. So he started with a brand new gun. He started with a large frame. Here's a flat top 44 Magnum. Ruger, of course, Black Hawk had the micro rear sight, flat top frame. He made the cylinder longer to accommodate the Keith bullets, and he also made it larger for added strength, a bigger margin of safety, which today with those that like super powerful revolvers, that's been a standard frame for a long time. So it's a good thing Bill did that. But now, don't want to get too many details here, but Bill Ruger and Bill Wilson of Great Western had kind of a riff when Great Western was first starting out. So Bill Ruger was not able to introduce his flat top until his flat top 44 mag Blackhawk until late 1956. So meanwhile, by about June or July of 1956, we had Bill Wilson of Great Western. He was quick to introduce the 44 Magnums. So yes, here you have a true Colt size gun, has still the Colt size cylinder, 1.650 inch outside diameter on the cylinder, and he offered them in 44 Magnum. There's one that's marked 44 mag, this one 44 mag, and so kind of interesting. And I got to clarify here, these guns will take 44 mag ammo and shoot it, and everything's fine and dandy, but me personally, I don't think there's enough margin of safety there for me to be comfortable. I'm one that I don't want a gun blown up accidentally for an unknown reason or anything else, so I don't personally shoot those with full power loads. So but again, Great Western beat Bill Ruger to the punch with a 44 Magnum, so that was kind of significant. Now another area where the Great Western was popular, of course, they did it in calibers from 22 up to 45. They did 38 Special, 357 Magnum, 44 Special, 45 Colt. Those were pretty much the standard offerings, but they also offered a cartridge that is a mystery cartridge, and they referred to it as the 357 Atomic. Now, if you do a search elsewhere, probably on the same day, we're going to release a video of the 357 Atomic. It won't be a long one, but it'll correspond with this video. And here's a couple of them that were factory chambered in 357 Atomic. You can see right on the barrel marking both of those. Now, you might be saying, what in the heck is a 357 Atomic? Well, nobody really knows right now. There's maybe somebody out there that does. I do not. John Taffin and I have talked about this extensively. I've talked to other people, including Jim Hubler and other people. Nobody's ever been able to come up with a 357 Atomic case. My opinion is, and we'll cover this better in the separate video, so scan that if you have an interest in it. They're probably going to lengthen the case, but ultimately we do know that they had Roy Weatherby test loads that were pushing 150 grain, 158 grain bullets at 1660 feet per second out of these. So anyway, he also chambered 357 Magnum. Where the gun really caught a lot of attention, though, was early on in the movie industry, because they were readily available. They were made in LA. The movie rental companies and other people could grab these guns up and run them into the movie set, and they could use them in the movies. Now, what's interesting is that if you ever watch a movie, they sometimes had Colt hammers in them, but the kind of the dead giveaway was very common to see that front sight. It was large if you look at it compared to a Colt. It was, and the later Colts, of course, after about 1910, had pretty big front sights too. Before then, they were a smaller front sight. But notice how close it sets to the end of the barrel. So that's always a flag in the movies when you see that sight right out at the end of the barrel. That's a Great Western. They were pretty commonly used, but there was many movie stars that endorsed the guns. And John Wayne, actually, of all people, he became a company spokesman for them. And he there's several pictures of him holding pairs of them and so forth. He actually had a very beautiful presentation grade made that were the Great Western's arms engraver was Carl Kortz. And now if you go back in the post-war era, there was virtually no engravers. There was so many losses at the end after World War II. Arts were lost and so forth, but there was nobody really had learned the trade of engraving. And so Carl Kortz was pretty much a self-taught engraver. His engraving started off pretty bad, but he progressed and got better and better as he went along. But ultimately, that set of guns were stolen, and they've never been recovered. They disappeared. I have a friend that speculated they probably went overseas, and that's where they're at, and that's probably accurate. That's probably what happened. So later, John Wayne was presented with a pair of 4 3/4 inch 45s, fully engraved, one-piece ivory stocks, and they had Colt hammers. And those guns were actually the pair that he used in the movie The Shootist. We'll try to get you a picture of those inserted. And they're on display at a Cowboy Museum right now, but they they were fully engraved. They had kind of a light brownish bluish finish to them. And Michael Wayne, John Wayne's son, commented, remember his dad soaking the stalks, the ivory stalks, in tea to get them to take on a yellowing effect. And they ultimately were used in the movie The Shootist. So, but there were many other people that were very significantly involved with Great Western. One was, of course, James Arness, who starred in the series Gunsmokes for forever, throughout its life. I think it started in the late 50s and went through the 70s. But anyway, he used both Colt and Great Western, but he was famous for his Great Western, gun. And let's see, there was Audie Murphy. He used them. He was a close associate with Great Western. There was it also might note that some of the early problems with Great Western got resolved when when Great Western hired away from Colt. One of their top employees named John McCormick. And McCormick was quite a savvy gun guy. And one of the things that Great Western did, I was trying to look at one here that's got a very obvious example of it. Not seeing it too well, but they had if you look close, there's one. If you look at that trigger, you see the copper color to it. Great Western used a what's known as beryllium copper for the trigger, the bolt, and the hand. So they were supposed to be more shock resistant, less prone to breakage, and so forth and so on. Personally, I don't think so. I've rebuilt too many Great Westerns, and they broke the same as Colts and anything else. And but yeah, the Hollywood really went for the Great Western in a big way, and the faster artists were very well known for using them. There was a gentleman by the name of Kilo Henderson, which small family connection here, but he was a Hollywood actor. He starred in a TV series called The 26 Men. My grandfather, Joe Pierce, was one of the original Arizona Rangers, and that's what that movie was about the 26 Arizona Rangers. And my grandfather, if you go back to the original tapes or the original, when they aired those back in the 50s, he would come on and he'd introduce the series. He'd say, "My name is Joe Pierce. I was the Arizona Ranger, and the following story you're about to see is true because I was there," or whatever it was. And he introduced the series. But this Kilo Henderson was one of the actors, and he became quite proficient at fast draw work and so forth. And he went to an event where the Colt was set up and so on, and they asked to see his guns. And he pulls them out, and they're a pair of Great Westerns, and they're like, "No!" So they gave him a pair of Colt single actions before he left, because they wanted him using Colt revolvers. Now, what's interesting, of course, Bill Wilson, he thought he had the market cornered on a single action Army pattern gun, but he did not, because in 1955 Colt began shipping the second generation series single action Army. Now, they were more than the Great Western, but you know what? They didn't struggle with the quality control problems that Great Western did, and they were the original. They had the beautiful bone and charcoal case colors, and they were Colt. They had the name, and they outsold Great Western, and it kind of put Great Western in a financial tizzy, if you will. Great Western was actually working on some very interesting projects and things. Oh, before I leave some of that, here's an interesting side note too. Thel Reed, the famous fast draw artist that set many world records using live ammunition and stuff, and this is more of a funny story than anything, he worked at Great Western when he was in junior high. He'd go out to get after school, or on weekends he'd go down there and work and learned how to build and time guns and so forth and so on. Can you imagine the anti-gunners today, junior high kids down there in a factory building guns? I mean, that's really pretty comical. I've talked to Thel Reed many times about that, and it's a pretty interesting story. But I have a picture of him and James Arness, who was somewhere around 6'4" to 6'6", depending on what source. And Thel, he's not a real big guy, and Thel's standing there with a single action, and here's James Arness, and it looks like a father and a son, a young son. It's pretty comical. So, and Phil says, man, you'd look up at him like this, you know. Anyway, but Great Western had a real interesting history. What's also interesting too is that you could order anything you wanted from them. You could order fully engraved, gold plating, cattle brand engraving, any style of stocks from mother pearl, ivory, carvings, just whatever you wanted. It was actually they were a very flexible company that way. So I've actually rebuilt a couple of them that had issues. Here's a couple I personally rebuilt, put in my own spec hammers and triggers, and of course cylinders with tight chambers, good quality barrels and so on. I make them great shooters. Keep the camera right there, Joe. I'll just reach over here. Here's a 44 Special that I built. I don't like the stocks, but it's what I had to put on at the time. But you can see that bluing, that purplish color bluing that comes out on them. And of course, again, that frame is heat treated 4140 steel. Here's a fairly rare 4 3/4 inch 44 Special. They're very difficult to find. Here's another interesting gun too. You rarely see these. The Deputy had click adjustable rear sight and a rib that went full length for the front sight, 4-inch barrel. And they were advertised in 38 and 44 Special, and I don't remember. It seemed like there was one other caliber there, but they did not produce very many of those. Very cool gun. And I'd love to see if factories do something similar to that today. So here's yet another gun that's extremely desirable. And this was known as their Fast Draw model. Had a brass backstrap and trigger guard. And they were produced a little later in the series. They typically had a little higher hammer spur. Actually, all Great Westerns kind of did because of the fanning, and they could, the fast draw artists could catch that hammer a little faster. Most guys are like, give me the Colt pattern one. That's fine. So yeah, there's one with maple stocks. I do not know if those are original or not. I know you could order those as a factory option. We covered the Atomic, the 357 Atomic and the 44 Magnums already. I've shown those. Of course, they did 22 rimfires as well. One issue, and I just kind of jumping around here a little bit, one issue that I occasionally saw was, and this is a problem with that frame-mounted firing pin, if they weren't fitted just so, the top of this hammer would break off. So this one here, if you look closely, it's broken right off. One of these days I'll fit a Colt hammer to it and make it right. But you can see better right there, broke right off. That's the weak link right there. But so other thing I forgot to mention, they produced some cap and ball revolvers and so on, but they also produced Derringers. And those were again popular in the movie because they were not a 41 rimfire as the original Remington Derringer was. So you could get these in 38 Special or 38 Smith & Wesson. And they had some issues with the with the top of the, had a bee biting me there, with the top of the with the frame cracking right here. So after serial number 1800 they beefed that up so they wouldn't break. But there they were, the popular little Derringer. They were again used throughout movies. Incidentally, Great Western produced about 22,000 single actions in that 10-year period. And they produced, I think 3,000, 3,300 Derringers, somewhere in that range. I don't know. Nobody really knows because there was actually a few guns that got out without being serial numbered. But they were, and again, this is not, I don't want to get into details of different ownership and so forth, but they started suffering financial troubles in the late 50s and early 60s. And it went on and on. Finally, at the end, for $59, you could order a Great Western kit. So the gun came in a kit form where you actually put it together, you flat file, you did the timing, you do all the stuff, you build the gun yourself. Interestingly, the kit guns that were sold as a kit, they will have the GW and then a 0 for the serial number, before the serial number. So this one is a kit gun, and they tell me a day the kit guns are worth money because you don't see them very often. They don't. Most people put them together. Sometimes varying degrees of quality. So there you have it. One of the things I was going to mention, the Haas revolver, or the J.P. Sauer and Son, that actually was a shoot-off from the Great Western. They were made in Germany, but when the company was having its final throw, there was a transition, and I won't get into that too much, but they were a completely different gun, even though there was some heritage in that process. But they featured the same firing pin system. Some people call it the Bradley system or the Christie system, whatever you want to call it, but it was the same thing. And today, to be very clear, the Great Western 2 is not the original Great Western Arms. It is made by Pieta in Italy. So, but that's where the name came from, because EMF, Early Modern Firearms, at one point, I think in 1959, they purchased Great Western Arms, and then have ultimately turned and sold them. But that's where that came from, was the Great Western 2 under the ownership of Boyd Davis. So, so there you have it. Great Western was a very iconic company. They had potential. They came this close, as the old saying goes, to really making it. It's unfortunate they just didn't quite bring it all together as they could have or should have. But it was nice to see a single action that's made in America, USA made. The collector's interest has kind of been on and off in these over the years. You know, they'll never bring what a Colt does, but there is some interest in them just because of the uniqueness of them being a quality, you know, being sometimes a quality built gun, other times not so. Built in USA, copy of the Colt single action. I got to finish with a story. John Taffin called me years ago. He's all excited. He'd gone down to a local gun shop in Boise, found a new in the box Great Western, nickel plated, 44 special, mother of pearl grips on it, still in the box, just a straight up gun, and took it out, went to shoot it, had all sorts of problems. I won't get into that too much. And I don't remember what he spent on that gun. John bought a lot of these Great Westerns at a time when they were 100, 125 bucks, and that's where you bought them all day long. But I want to say he spent like 800 bucks on this gun, and he was excited to get it just because it was brand new in the box and kind of a rare caliber and finish and mother of pearl stocks and everything. But ultimately he wound up putting as much or more into that gun, getting it running, because he had to hire a gunsmith to do it, to get it to working, than what he'd paid for it. Now myself, I've run into problems, but you know, it's like, okay, barrel needs set back or whatever it is that needs to be done, I just do it. But John did not. He would always take it down to the local gunsmith and they'd work it over, whatever. So so anyway, there you have it. A little bit of overview of Great Western Arms Company and some of their history. They were a very unique company, and they do hold a rightful spot in the place of American history. So thanks for joining us, and be sure and watch the next video. Should release the same day on the 357 Atomic. We'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the Pierce Brothers.